This is the Reading with Rachelle podcast, where we will explore history we never learned in school but wish we had. I'm Rachelle Chase, an author and a columnist, and this week's book is A Short History of Black Craft in 10 Objects, and my guest is the author, Robell Awake. I received an advanced reader's copy, which is also known as an uncorrected proof, of A Short History of Black Craft in 10 Objects from Princeton Architectural Press. The book grabbed me from the beginning when I read the stunning statistic that Robell says he stumbled upon in an essay written by historian James E. Newton titled Slave Artisans and Craftsmen, The Roots of Afro-American Art, that talked about artisans in the southern United States. Robell wrote, in 1865, Black skilled artisans outnumbered white artisans 5-1. With an estimated 100,000 Black artisans versus 20,000 white artisans. Black folks were the backbone of the building and craft trades throughout the South. In this week's episode, Robell and I discuss this fact along with the impact Black artisans have had on American art and design through a few of the book's objects and their creators and Robell's work. A little bit about Robell. Robell Awake is a chairmaker, teacher, and researcher based in Atlanta, Georgia. He was recently selected as one of the Dwell 24, which Dwell magazine awards for the best emerging designs from around the world. His book, A Short History of Black Craft in 10 Objects, will be released February 4th, 2025. Check out the show notes for more information about my guest, Robell Awake, his book, A Short History of Black Craft in 10 Objects, and me, Rachelle Chase. All right, Robell, welcome to Reading with Rachelle. I am happy to have you here today.
So glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I was really thrilled to get an advance copy of your book, but I really wanted the physical book. I was like, this is great. These stories, of course, every chapter felt like a wow moment that I had not heard of any of that history. So I was really happy to get the copy. So wanted to thank you for that.
Thanks.
Wanted to start a little bit. First off, I saw beautiful images of your furniture, of your work that you do on your website. And so I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about yourself and your work first before we jump into your book, A Short History of Black Crafts in 10 Objects.
Yeah, so I make furniture. For the past few years, I've just been making ladder back chairs, particularly a style that was pioneered by a multi-generational family of formerly enslaved chair makers in central Tennessee, the Pointer family, which there's a chapter in the book about them. But they've inspired this sort of new body of work that I've been sort of making for the past 2-3 years now. And yeah, I started making furniture about 10 years ago. And my background my way into furniture was through construction. I did a lot of different things. I welded for a couple of years. I framed homes for a few years. I did trim work and a lot of different sort of like trade kind of work. And then just got more interested kind of in furniture about a decade ago. And really, it was always something I did not full time up until the pandemic. So I made furniture and tried to sell it on the side. I made furniture for friends and family. And then during the pandemic, decided to just go ahead and try to just do it full time, do it for a living. And I should say I've always read and been really interested in history. And so reading about craft history, initially furniture, like about Black furniture makers in history, was what got me into just more broader craft research. And that's just been something that, I'm just a curious person and just wanted, who was doing what? Who was making these things back in the day? Like, where were they at? What kind of things were they making? So.
Yeah. Did that interest come like as you were creating your own work, or did that come before you were doing your work? Where did that come from?
Yeah. I think I've always been interested in history, and I've always read and whatever I'm getting into, I really do deep dives and get really into it and want to know more and want to place myself and put myself in context of like doing this thing. And I think what really fueled it was that furniture making is it's a pretty white space, it's a pretty male space. And it was really hard initially to even, never mind, see people that look like me doing this thing. It was even find stories of people that look like me in the past that did this thing. So once I really started researching, then it just opened up a whole world of Black people that were doing all kinds of things, amazing, incredible work. And I think what was so significant to me is particularly was reading one paper by James Newton, who was a Black historian who wrote a lot about Black craft and the different like Black trades in early America. And he, through census data, discovered that in the South, that what was called the mechanical arts, so anything from being a seamstress to being a woodworker and a blacksmith and things that required some sort of like a higher level of skill, was dominated by Black folks. It was really 5 to 1. There were 100,000 Black artisans and craftspeople to 20,000 white in the antebellum South leading up to the Civil War. So that really blew my mind because I was just like, wow, like this went from like we were dominating the skilled trades and crafts, and then fast forward to now, and you're hard pressed to find that history.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you opened your book with that finding and that statistic, and that was a wow moment for me as well. I was stunned, and by a lot of things come from enslaved people, but I think the arts and the crafts and just some of these like things we take for granted in everyday life, I hadn't really thought about that. What types of products, what types of inventions, what types of things would have come out of that. So that was what I mean when I said there was a wow in every chapter. That was the wow because I'm like, wow, here's an industry or here's an area that I didn't know about. What else was really interesting is when you said that this showed up as a way of to resist oppression and erasure through art making. You have examples of that too in your book, which I want to talk a little bit about. But let me go back first to talk about the 10 objects or the 10 areas that you chose. Can you give an overview of the different areas that are in the book and how you discovered those, especially since it was very hard, you mentioned, to find information historically? Can you just give a little bit of information about that?
Yeah, sure. So the book covers a wide range of different mediums. There's textile artists, so the quilters of Gee's Bend is a chapter, and Harriet Powers, who made incredible narrative story quilts, is a chapter. There's also woodworkers, so I have a couple furniture makers like Thomas Day and Lewis Buckner, who are talked about, as well as that chair maker and his family, Richard Pointer, who inspired the chairs that I make right now to continue his legacy and carry his name forward. I make those chairs. And blacksmiths, there's Philip Simmons, legendary 20th century blacksmith from Charleston, South Carolina, who made decorative wrought iron gates, window grills, and just was an incredible artist. And the pottery, there's a chapter on the face jug tradition from Old Edgefield, South Carolina. So, and then there's also more kind of conceptual chapters like Black architecture and the hidden history of the American front porch, which I'm really excited about too, because it kind of like, I feel like I wrote people in like, oh, I'm just going to study these objects. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute. I can't really pick a front porch as an object, but this story is incredible and it really needs to be out there and people need to know about it. So yeah, so it's a wide range of things. There's also Anne Lowe, who was a fashion designer, who was a third generation seamstress from Alabama. She was the first Black person, never mind Black woman, to run a couture dress shop on Madison Avenue. This is mid 20th century. She made the wedding dress for Jacqueline Kennedy, which is known as like the most photographed wedding dress of all time. So her story is there. Yeah, so it's a wide range of things. There's another chapter that's a kind of more conceptual too, which is the one on assemblage art. And that goes into the yard show tradition of Black neighborhoods in the South, where it was basically public art. that's been going on for generations in the South, where things that have been discarded and things that are found objects were put together to make just huge outdoor art displays in people's yards, which you can still find a lot. There's a well-known house in Atlanta in Oakhurst is the neighborhood that it's called, where there is a yard show that is really well known and people go to visit it.
Hmm. You say when you rope them in with there's these 10 objects. I think also, which was a really wonderful surprise, is you don't just talk about the objects. There is a lot of history in there, like what was going on at that time period, information about the specific person, about the impact of whatever that invention or that piece of art was. It's a shorter book, but you really take advantage or make every word work in that there's no fluff. It is just this wonderfully readable, rich book that really, really amplifies not only these people and what they've done, but the impact that they have today. It's a great
Yeah,
job.
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really am more than like obsessing about like the objects and the right objects. It's more about craft as a vehicle to tell the story of Black life in America in different places at different time periods, because it was such a nuanced and different experience. Like people and Black people were really people who could express agency through in the most oppressive circumstances, obviously, especially in the antebellum South, but through skill and through ingenuity, people were able to carve out a somewhat of a little bit of more agency for themselves through this. And it's mainly just to it was a vehicle to tell the story of Black life. It was the overarching goal of this book, and use craft as that vehicle.
Yeah. I I wanted to get back to the point about resisting oppression and erasure through art making. And if we could talk about a couple of examples in there that were just really stunning, like David Drake's poem, Boston, which I didn't realize was a person when until you explained that. Could you just share maybe a little bit about those two examples? Mm.
Yeah, those are really great examples. Yeah. David Drake was a potter in Edgefield, South Carolina, which had the largest, at the time, the largest stoneware manufacturing industry in America. And stoneware essentially was just really durable pottery that people use to store. They would use them as crocks. So you would store like salted meats, and you'd use them to store large vessels to hold water. And a lot of these really large vessels were going to plantations to store these meats and store water for the enslaved. And David Drake, he was throwing some of the largest pots, which is a very not only labor intensive, but a very highly skilled thing to do. You're talking like 40 gallon huge containers to store food and water and things like that. And he was inscribing poetry in them. And you got to think at this time, this was pre-Civil War in the antebellum South. Like that was a very radical act. And his poems were just, I mean, they still resonate to this day. And they were just so skillfully, I think skillfully worded in a way to where it could disarm the white gaze, and it'd be like, oh, this is just some potter like saying these harmless words. But I think any Black person reading the words then and now can feel the pain and the longing in some of his poetry. And I was talking to somebody recently, and they were like, it's almost like he was self-publishing in a way. It's like people were reading this in these plantations, and he knew who was going to see these poems on these plantations. And it's just such a captivating story. It's really incredible.
Right.
Yeah.
And the
And
risk, you point out the risk he's taking by doing that, right?
the risk, yeah, and I note in the chapter too that it was said that he was missing a leg, and a lot of people think it was repercussions from doing this.
Yeah, before we talk about Boston, though, when you mentioned Edgefield, the involvement of African Americans and enslaved African Americans in the pottery industry as well, It was interesting talking about some of these influences from Africa that the enslaved people then included in their work and their products that have become, things that we use today. And I think one of the things you mentioned with the pottery was this alkaline.
Oh, the alkaline
Yeah, the
glaze. Yeah.
glaze.
Yeah, yeah. What also recurs a lot in the book, and this also shows up in the front porch, and how newly arrived Haitian immigrants after the Haitian Revolution in the early 1800s, they brought with them the shotgun home, which attached to it was a front porch, the ubiquitous shotgun home with front porch, which kind of really took off with the influx of those Haitian immigrants in New Orleans and then spread throughout the Southeast. And the shotgun home with its porch became the most recognizable residential form of architecture for the poor and working class in the South. And that kind of evolved into just like what we know, like that. From there, the front porch really took off. And then it starts showing up in states and places like that. So, like in the same story with the face jugs in Edgefield, the face jugs are just these incredible sculptural vessels where you have these faces that a lot of times look very frightening, and just kind of like each of them are so unique. They're all idiosyncratic. They're not copies of one another. And for a long time, people didn't really know what was the use of these face vessels, because the enslaved were making this during their free time. These weren't things that they were making for sale, that the white pottery owner was selling. So this was something that was made for the African American community at the time. So then through research in the past couple of decades, it came to find out, people have always suspected that there was some sort of talismanic or spiritual quality to these things, and somehow connected to hoodoo. And one interesting story that I put in the chapter is that it is widely believed now that kind of the origins of this face jug tradition, which started in Edgefield, and it spread throughout the South, to where there are a lot of white face jug makers in the Southeast and in Appalachia. And I think decades ago, people didn't know that it was a distinctly African American tradition that spread, and white people started making face jugs. It was just like most things, assumed that some white person started it, and now it's here. The direct connection to a ship, the Wanderer, which was an illegal vessel carrying enslaved people after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished. This was mid 1800s. Its captives were mostly from the Congo or the Congo Basin, and a majority of those on that ship wound up in Edgefield, in that pottery manufacturing center. And that is precisely when this face jug tradition can be dated back to, and where it began. So what ends up happening is that this new crop of Black folks comes in and reinvigorates spiritual traditions with traditional African spirituality. And then these face vessels emerge. So I think for me, that really resonates, for me being first generation in this country. My parents immigrated from Ethiopia in the 60s. And I think for me, it's like to hear these stories that there have always been Black people immigrating, and the diaspora has always been immigrating and adding in influences into Black culture here. And that Black art and culture has always been a kind of syncretic fusion and a communal project of so many different Black cultures, because Blackness to me is the most diverse category, the most rich tapestry of phenotypes and languages and food and culture. And we're always bringing elements and remixing it and merging it. And that's what's so dope about it. And I think like to know that that was even happening in the 1800s, like it wasn't this like we think about, and that's the thing, is like we think about the past as this like stagnant, like everybody was the same. Everybody was like, no, like we were always doing this. We were always kind of like doing things in this way. And that was really cool. And I want to bring those stories out.
Yeah, I took us down a different path. When you were talking about David Drake. So before I forget to go back to Boston, yeah, when we were talking about other forms of showing or resisting oppression. You had that Boston example. Can you just share that as well?
Yeah, for sure. So this is actually just, I found this story from an article in the Charleston Courier, which is a newspaper in Charleston. And the reason it was in this paper is because it is dealing with a piece of furniture that was credited to Robert Walker, who was a very big cabinet maker in Charleston during the 18th century, so like mid to late 1700s. And there was a very big sort of neoclassical kind of like furniture tradition in Charleston at this time. There were a lot of cabinet makers who were really well known and prominent. And Robert Walker is probably arguably one of the biggest ones. And there was an article about how at a recent auction, I think it was in Maine, somebody who had worked in Charleston as a furniture restorer was purchasing a piece because he thought it was a Robert Walker piece. And when he went to examine it and take out a drawer, he saw a signature and a date, and it said Boston, and there was a date on it. And he didn't know what it was. And then come to find out through census records, Boston was a formerly enslaved cabinet maker who was working at Robert Walker's shop at the time, and was like then and now still trying to take credit for his work. And I think what's just so powerful about that signature is that I went to the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts a few years ago, which is in Winston-Salem, and it has a great collection of decorative arts. So all kinds of cabinets and chairs and furniture, and it has Robert Walker pieces. And when you go in there, it just says Robert Walker, cabinet maker, 17 something to 18 something, and this huge, ornate, elaborate chest. And when you're walking into that museum, I'm just thinking like middle school kids on field trips and things like that. They're looking at this and they're like, wow, this guy was incredible. But the reality is other people were making this thing. We don't know who made this thing. And for all we know, Robert Walker was just a wealthy shop owner when everything was being made by indentured servants and enslaved folks like Boston. So I think it's still, to me, we're still fighting to get recognition for people like Boston who are actually doing the work and making the things, because these institutions are still not acknowledging that. So that signature still is incredibly powerful to this day because he's still fighting for credit for his work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for doing your part to get some of this awareness out there, some credit where credit is
Thanks.
due. Was there anything that you found really that was most surprising for you in doing this research and doing the stories that you included in here? Was there something that really was like, I don't know, it's all amazing, but even more amazing to you?
I think the one story that kind of like took me aback or added like a little more confusion, but good confusion about the past and how we really don't know how nuanced and just hyper local a lot of the racial dynamics were, is the story of Anna Kingsley and the Kingsley plantation in Spanish Florida. So Spanish Florida, before it became a part of America, had a very different kind of system of enslavement. It was like the task labor system, which was also in Charleston, South Carolina, with that huge kind of rice production industry, which is that you had people who were responsible for a task, and when they were done with the task, they had free time to do what they pleased. So it's a different form of things. I'm not going to sit here and say it was a better form or anything like that. It was still enslavement, period, full stop. But the interesting thing about Anna Kingsley's story is that she was enslaved to Zephaniah Kingsley in Spanish Florida before it was America. And she was 13 years old when he got her from, I think, Cuba and brought her to his plantation. 4 or 5 years later, they entered into a common law marriage, which you could do across racial lines in Spanish Florida, which again is just like showing you how hyper local a lot of these like racial dynamics and power structures were. And then she managed Zephaniah Kingsley's multiple plantations and the enslaved on those plantations. Her original name was Anna, I forget her name, but she was from Senegal. She was Senegalese. And it was believed, I think folklore, that she was some type of royalty in Senegal. Either way, this Black woman, at around the age in her 20s, began managing these multiple plantations and the enslaved. And what's so interesting about Kingsley Plantation is the enslaved dwellings, which are arranged in a semicircle in a very traditional sort of West and West Central African fashion, with a communal garden that was in the middle. And that points to this thing like, okay, like, why is this the case? Was Anna Kingsley trying to recreate home in a way? Was Anna Kingsley allowing the enslaved to recreate home in a way? Did she allow them more freedoms? Was she kind of like what was the deal here? Like she still enslaved people, right? But also at the same time, like we can't write her off or cancel her because of that, because like there's so much, it just complicates things for me, and to the point where I'm like, I just think that I just want to know more, as opposed to shying away and being like, oh, this is a time period where we have to write off all these people. We have to write off that, like, it's pretty incredible that this young woman was able to like do this for herself. And what ended up happening when America took over Florida is she fled. She fled with her family to, I think, Santo Domingo, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and left Florida. So yeah, I mean, it's like stories like that. And like Thomas Day, there's another story about the cabinet maker Thomas Day, who was he was Black, he was from North Carolina, and he was the wealthiest, most prominent cabinet maker in North Carolina in the 1800s. Employed white and enslaved people in his cabinet shop, went to a white church, was very embraced by the white community there, and was like this prominent figure, but also enslaved people. And I think like the story of other Black folks enslaving people is a very uncomfortable one, and a very, quite frankly, aggravating one. But also at the same time, it kind of points to the fact that like, I think we're having a reckoning now in America where we're starting to realize that representation isn't everything. And there's a quote that's been circulating the internet at a commencement speech at, I think it was Spelman, where the woman said, "Black faces in high places won't save us." And I think that story is a very age-old story in America. There have always been people who have been crossing that threshold in a way and gaining prominence and gaining agency, and somehow in one way or another colluding with the white supremacist power structure. Could you say that maybe they were, more gracious to those they enslaved and somehow were harboring more of a safe space for their enslaved? Probably. Maybe. Who knows? Maybe it's a case by case thing. Maybe Thomas Day was, horrible and was just like a Black person that enslaved people and also didn't treat them well, or Anna Kingsley was incredible and recreated this sort of African home in Spanish Florida in the way she could. It just makes me want to know more than anything else. And it just makes me more interested and fascinated.
Yeah, it is. It's complicated, and I know I can't remember. There were a couple of other people I had read about in history that were prominent Black people that had enslaved. Yeah, anyway, I can't remember, but there is this. You do want to know more, and I don't know when you talk about people saying, well, maybe it was a way to have the enslaved have a better life, et cetera, et cetera. Part of that is kind of like, is that wishful thinking? Is that really because that's what we want to believe? Or is it like, as you said, it does make you want to know more. What was the reasoning behind this? And I think I have read other books about even other like indigenous people having had slaves. So it's like, it's a complicated part of history that needs more
Super. Yeah.
info.
I think honestly, to me, it just makes it seem that like, it makes the past more relatable, because I feel like the present is just as complicated. There's a lot of, not to like interject too much of my personal political beliefs, but I do feel like there is a lot of belief that somehow Black business is the answer. And I'm not saying it's not the answer, but I do think that there's a lot of people who really believe in Black capitalism, and that like, I personally don't believe that that is the answer. And I do think that, to me, there's a lot of rhetoric that makes me think like you're replacing a white factory owner and a white person at the head of the already inherently exploitative model of society with a Black person is not any different. It's not really changing things fundamentally. So I think like that's a similar thing to me, is that like, oh, people were dealing with a lot of similar sort of context and making similar decisions in the past. And I think one person could, like, you could say like, oh yeah, what does it mean if you're a Black business, but at the same time, like you're paying employees not a livable wage, they're not offering them healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. should we just be lauding you because you're a Black business owner? Like, I think that's a similar sort of thing to me.
Which ties into what you were saying about the Black enslavers. So when people read your book, what do you want them to get out of this when you wrote it? What do you want people to get out of your book?
Yeah. I think I want people to get out of like this, that I think, like we've been talking about, Black life was so nuanced and different depending on where you were and what you did and what time period it was. And that's some Black people, given their context and their skill, really achieved the closest thing they could to like freedom and agency given the circumstances. And it was a really incredible feat. But also that more than just Black labor building the modern world in America, it was also Black technology and ingenuity, so much of which is hiding in craft. So much of that story is in craft skill. It was in the skill that the blacksmiths brought. It was in the skill that the rice producers from West Africa brought, and the indigo dyers, and all of those highly skilled things that the colonists could not do. America would not have happened, and we wouldn't have the foundations of this modern world, not only its economy, but also its technologies. And I think like that's what I'm trying to also present.
All right. Well, I hope everyone listening goes out and buys A Short History of Black Craft in 10 Objects, and that'll be available February 5th, correct? 2025, right? Where can they find out more information about you in the book?
Oh, yeah. You can go to my website, robellawake.com. That's ROBELLAWAKE.com. It'll be coming out through Princeton Architectural Press. So if you go to their website too, you can also pre-order it.
All right, Robell, thank you so much for being on Reading with Rachelle. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.